Shalom everyone, my name is Jacqueline Luz and we welcome you all to a new video on our channel Jóvenes Peregrinando or Youth Pilgrims to continue with our series of study of the Torah in English. Today's study is called A Perfect Justice and Not a Humanist Ethic, and our study will be based on chapter 21 and chapter 22 from verses 1 to 15. As we have been studying throughout the past couple of videos, the people of Israel have now left Egypt, liberated by the Eternal through the hand of Moshe, and they began traveling through the wilderness heading towards the promised land, the land that the Eternal promised to Abraham, as we've seen previously. Yet during the time that they have been traveling, we already saw moments where the people of Israel complained against Moshe and Aaron for having brought them out to the wilderness where there was no water or food. And we see that the Eternal then provided the people of Israel with the water and food that they needed. We see that he did so through Moshe, through the tossing of a tree into the water, by hitting a rock with the staff, and with the descending of the manna from the heavens. Through each and every one of these moments, we came to understand that the Eternal was actually testing them to see if they would keep his commandments. And after all this, the people of Israel reached Mount Sinai, which is where we are situated now within the book of Exodus. And we saw that there he manifested his presence, and then he gave the 10 phrases to the people of Israel. And as we understand, it's not just 10 commandments, but it's 10 phrases with 14 commandments. Within the religious institutions, and if any of us have probably been to a church school, then we will remember that within those places, they only ever really teach the 10 commandments. Some places don't even regard these at all, or if they do teach them, they teach them incorrectly, or they say that the Messiah came to abolish them and established 2 new commandments. Yet in these next 2 chapters that we will be analyzing, and as well going forward, we will see that in reality, the Eternal gave far more than just 2 or 10 commandments. And most importantly, these instructions that were given by the Eternal, that we will see next, are instructions or ordinances of justice, a perfect justice that the Eternal gives of morality, conduct, attitude, etiquette, etc. And it's a justice that we don't see in the world applied as the Eternal actually established and how he wanted it to be. And these instructions that we are going to see are also detailed instructions of the 10 phrases given by the Eternal. Now, many of these instructions are still applicable to our days, or at least the principal meaning behind most of them, whereas other instructions are not, such as the sacrifice of the animals and the temple. The Messiah came to establish a new and renewed pact for the people and the nations to substitute the old pact, where the blood of an animal had to be shed for the covering of sins. Through his perfect offering, he was able to establish a new congregation, a celestial one, edified through those who believe in him and with him as our great minister. Therefore, we have no need for the instructions given by the Eternal on how to raise a temple or what type of animal sacrifices we have to do for certain events and in order to approach the Father. But we can certainly still take the principle behind these instructions and learn from them. In the end, we must remember as well and always keep in mind that the Torah isn't the end. It was given by the Father and written in our mind and heart so that we can always remember it in our day-to-day life. And it is also a guide for us, like an instruction manual for us during our pilgrimage, so that we know what we must or what we shouldn't do, and how we can serve the Father and exalt him, and how we can keep our body, which is the temple, pure. And so are Yeshua's teachings. We know that they are not the end, that once we start to learn his teachings, it doesn't mean that we have finally received salvation. But in the end, or in reality, these are there to confirm everything that we learn in the Torah. And they help us further understand what is the will of the Father in our lives and how can we apply his instruction into our life. And this is something that we're also going to see and analyze within this study. And we understand that both Yeshua's teachings and the Torah are fundamental pillars for our life as believers. In Revelations chapter 14, verse 12, it says, "Here is the perseverance of the Kedoshim, and those are those who are separated and consecrated by the Eternal. And it says, those who keep the commandments of Elohim and the faith of Yeshua. So we need to have both in order to actually persevere within our pilgrimage, in order to know how to serve the Father and to live a life that is separated and consecrated before Him. So beginning with our study, we see within the first verse of chapter 21 that it says, now these are the ordinances which you will set before them. In other versions, both in English and Spanish, we can find the conjugation and, as well as in the Hebrew script. And this means that although these verses have been separated into chapters, and we must know and understand as well that in reality, when all of this was written, it wasn't separated into chapters or into numbers. They are actually linked together. So chapter 21 and chapter 20 are actually linked together. It's a continuation of what we were seeing in chapter 20. Therefore, these instructions aren't really separate from the instructions that he gave within the 10 phrases. And within this verse, we also find a type of instruction that the Eternal will be giving to his people. We know that the Torah is the instruction of the Eternal to his people, yet within the Torah, we can find and categorize these into different types of instructions as well, as we will see later on. In verse 1 in Hebrew, the word for ordinance is mishpat, which we can find in Strong's dictionary in Hebrew 4141. And this word means properly a verdict, favorable or unfavorable, pronounced judicially, especially a sentence or a formal decree. And a root that we can also find within this word of mishpat is shafat, which comes from Hebrew 8199, which means to judge, that is to pronounce a sentence. And by extension to govern, passively to litigate, or by implication to vindicate or punish. So we understand that these ordinances or decrees have to do with the justice that the Eternal establishes for his people. And these ordinances of justice that the Eternal established teach morality, education, correct conduct, and etiquette as well. Some of them we will see won't apply in the same literal way as they did back then, but we can still learn and apply them into our life, their principal teaching that we see, or the meaning that they had. So the first principle, or the first ordinance that we see within this chapter 21, are the laws regarding the slaves. So we can find this in verses 2 to 11. Part of the humanist ethic and belief is that we should all live our life in freedom. So when they see the word slavery, they immediately have a negative connotation, thinking only of oppression. And this is something that a lot of us are taught within school. We are taught that slavery usually has to deal with oppression, has to do with evil done to a minor race, and stuff like that. Yet, when we analyze their definition of freedom, on the other hand, we note that the freedom they want to live, or the one that they expect to live and receive, is one that leads to a lack of morality, a freedom that leads to a lack of restraints, and a life that satisfies their ego in doing whatever they want to do without having to conform to another person's rules or another person's laws or decrees. Yet, in verses 2 to 11, although we see here ordinances regarding slavery within the people of Israel, we must first study and understand the context so we can fully understand the meaning behind these laws, so we don't misinterpret them nor find ourselves influenced by the humanist mindset of today. Now, for the people of Israel, looking within the scriptures and understanding what the Eternal is trying to teach, slavery wasn't a form of oppression, nor did it involve a hierarchical abuse. It was an opportunity allowed by the Eternal so that any Israelite man could free themselves from any debt they could have acquired, be it by the mismanagement of their resources, or damage to their property that was done, or expenses acquired that they could not cover. Any man who found himself in a debt that they could not pay off had the opportunity to go to his brothers within the people of Israel and exchange their service for a certain payment that they needed so they could settle the situation. And as we see within these verses, they didn't last as slaves forever. And the slave owners or the masters understood this. They knew that that brother or that Israelite that came to them wasn't going to be their slave forever. They understood that they were only going to serve for a period of 6 years, which was the period that the Eternal gave, and by the 7th year, they had to be liberated from their service as slaves. On the other hand, there were also prisoners of war who could become slaves. Now, these were acquired during their fights and conquest heading towards the promised land. And it was an opportunity that these prisoners of war also had to be liberated from their previous kingdom and to work to earn their own living now within the people of Israel. It was also an opportunity that they had to have a home where they could sleep and have food, given that this was also provided by their owner. And they also had the opportunity to leave on the 7th year, when all slaves who wanted could be liberated. Now, for those who acquired a wife by their owner during the time that they were slaves, that they were serving their Israelite brother, if they decided to leave the 7th year, then they had to leave their wife and children as well, or if they had any, because they would become property of their masters, or they were property of their masters, given that the wife was given to him by the owner. Yet, if they loved their owner, their wife and children, and they were willingly wanting to stay and serve more years, then as a consequence, their ear would be pierced before the judges in demonstration that he was willing to continue being a servant to his master. That this wasn't something that the master was abusing. This wasn't something that the master was imposing before the servant or before that Israelite. It was something that the Israelite himself chose to do. Although it says that they would be servant forever, in Hebrew we come to understand that it does not mean for an eternity, but instead it had to do with a certain period of time that was established by the Eternal as well. And we know this as the Yobel. If a slave stayed with their owner and worked under them for 49 years, this was the period established by the father, 7 times 7 years, then by the 50th year, which was the year of the Yobel, they were to be completely liberated. And this is something that we are going to study later on, that we are going to further understand, and we will see how the Eternal continued to establish more ordinances regarding slavery amongst the people of Israel. Now, within world history, we can find many cases of slavery where the slave owner would abuse their slaves and those who worked under them, their servants, or where different situations and systems, or institutions, and systems would oppress their subjects with their own ideals, embedding fear into their people so they would follow their decrees. Oftentimes, we see the cases where if they weren't following the laws that were instituted by them, then we see that a consequence or a result that they would have was death if they weren't following those rules that were applied. All of this we know is incorrect. This type of slavery being applied in that way is incorrect, and it is a result of the lack of understanding of the Father's will. Now, the slavery that we see here, though, within the scriptures was not one of oppression and evil against others, nor was it a hierarchical empowerment that left minorities in danger, as we analyzed earlier, with famish or with lack of resources. On the contrary, the Eternal established these ordinances so that the Israelites would not abuse of their brothers and prisoners of war, and so that those who had a need or were in debt could have an opportunity to be freed from it. Now, we also see another type of slavery mentioned within these verses, and it has to do with a father who decided to sell his daughter to be a maidservant. And maybe because they had a need, or they did not have they did not have resources that they needed, and so therefore the only way to get that would be through their daughter. And obviously we will also understand that this was something that the daughter was fully aware of, that she understood her rights as well. Which is what we're going to analyze in this portion. Now, these female maidservants did not have the same time of liberation as the male servants had, or as the male slaves had. The owner also had the opportunity to marry his maidservant, given that he had to pay a price in order to acquire her. This was like giving the father the dowry in order to marry his daughter. We see that if the owner was not pleased with his maidservant, then there was an opportunity for her to be redeemed. She was not to be sold to foreign people. But had he acquired her as his wife, or had he given her to a son as his wife, then she had to be treated as such. If they acquired another wife, or if they had a wife, then they had to give the maidservant who had become their wife the same treatment in food, the same treatment in clothing, and conjugal rights as well. If they did not provide these to the woman, then the maidservant was free to go without a payment. Through this, we can understand that the Eternal established ordinances so the woman could also be protected and she wouldn't be mistreated or abused by her owner or husband. Today, we hear cases of women getting sold off by their families and then getting mistreated by the men who acquired her. And this is a very sad situation in which many or any woman can find herself. And this is a consequence of mankind not knowing the importance or truth about marriage and for the lack of obedience to the Father. Given that these laws that we see here today, ordained by the Eternal, that we see or that we are analyzing right now, can still be applied even within those situations. Ordinances that can protect a woman from being abused or mistreated in any type of situation. If these principles or if the principles behind these mishpatim, behind these instructions given by the Father, were to be applied until this day, then we would not see the cases occur. Continuing on, the next type of laws that we're going to see are the laws regarding violence or quarrels against our neighbor or our family. And we will see these, or we can read these between verses 12 to 25. So I separated these into different portions, and the first type of laws that we will see are violence that leads to death of our neighbor, be it on purpose or by accident. And these laws were given, or we can find them in verses 12 to 14. The Eternal ordained that if anyone striked another Israelite, then they were to surely die. This was known as the retaliation law. Some countries today still apply this principle as well. When someone kills another person or a group of people out of anger and hatred, we see that they receive, in many cases, a life sentence, meaning that they live the rest of their life within a prison or they have to die. They are given the death penalty. On the other hand, the Eternal also establishes that if a person kills someone else, but it is an accident and it is something that the Eternal himself allowed, for example, maybe they were working on their land, they were plowing the field, and the moment that they lifted up their instrument with which they're working on their field, they accidentally let it go, it goes flying off, and there's another Israelite walking behind them, and that instrument accidentally strikes them and they die. We see here that the Eternal establishes that they will not receive death, and instead they were to take refuge in places appointed by the Father. Now, something that we can see here is that in some of these cases, when it happens like this on accident, the Eternal himself is allowing it. Now we come to understand that this also means that the Eternal would use these events as an instrument to bring justice or punishment towards anybody who was probably rebelling against him or who had done something wrong but nobody else really knew or that wasn't discovered yet. So this was also a method that the Eternal would use in order to establish justice without maybe other people fully understanding it. This is something that we see here. And this is why we see that the Eternal establishes these places, these appointed places that we will learn later on are called cities of refuge. And we can see these mentioned in Numbers chapter 35, Deuteronomy chapter 4 and 19, and in the book of Joshua, chapter 20. The murderer who killed unintentionally would flee towards the cities of refuge, where the family of the person that was killed would not be able to sentence to death the murderer, and that person, that homicide, I believe, or that murderer, would have to stay there until the great minister who was there died. After the great minister would die, then they were free to go. Obviously, with the understanding as well that that incident, that accident that caused the death of another person was already forgiven of him. The next set of laws that we can see within this portion are the loss of violence or cursing against our parents. Now, we find these in verses 15 and in verse 17. When we analyze the 10 phrases with the 14 commandments, one of the things that we noted or learned there was that the first commandment with the promise is in verse 12, when it says, "Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long upon the land which Adonai your Elohim is giving you." Now, this ordain that we see here specifically in both verses 15 and 17 can be seen rather harsh for some. But in this way, we can see how the Eternal instilled discipline as well into the Israelites, understanding that it was important for them to fulfill their Creator's commandments, because if they did not, then their life would not be prolonged and they would be put to death, meaning that they wouldn't be able to reach the promised land, and they would also be taken away spiritually from the celestial people of Israel, from the actual land that the Eternal was trying to edify. So through this misbehavior against their parents, we see that they had this consequence. And later on, we will see another instruction that the Eternal gives, where if a son was not doing what they were supposed to, as in helping out in the house or working, and if they were being disobedient to their parents, then the parents would take them out before the judges explaining the case, and then the son would be taken out and stoned to death for their misbehavior. Again, these instructions may seem harsh for us now living today, but the principle behind them was to establish and teach discipline in the sons and daughters, so they would not seek to hit their parents nor curse at them or disobey them. This was the main principle that we see behind these instructions. It wasn't so that the Eternal would kill every son and every daughter that was misbehaving, and so that the parents would be able to get rid of their children whenever they did that. On the contrary, we understand that this was a form of discipline. Today, we see this discipline instilled by the parents by probably giving them a punishment that they deserve for something that they did wrong. And this is totally understandable and something that we even see within the scripture be accepted, because we also see in Proverbs that the father corrects his son in the same way that the Eternal corrects his children, meaning us, who are believers and who are serving him with faith and with understanding. So this correction and discipline is something that the Eternal approves of, and that he has tried to teach within the scriptures, and he teaches and he taught us through these ordinances that he established. Now, recently, some movements and ideologies have arisen that state that children have their own rights, and therefore any sign of abuse shown to the children on behalf of their parents means that the parents are sentenced to judgment, while custody over their children is revoked from them. Sadly, this right given to the children has been abused as well, and we see cases where children misbehave and disobey their parents, even going so far as to hitting them whenever they don't receive what they want. And this is how we come to hear stories of children killing their own parents, or stories of children complaining against their parents just because they were corrected by them, they received discipline from their parents, and due to their misbehavior. And this is something that they don't like. This is something that they don't want anymore because they have these rights. As believers, we must honor our parents. This is something that we understand. And honoring our parents comes when we fulfill the Father's Torah. If we fulfill his Torah, then we are showing that love and appreciation to our parents completely. And we understand as well that we must be humble before our parents in every single moment, even in the moments where our parents are wrong. And it also means that when they are wrong, when we're being humble before them, we don't argue against them, nor do we curse at them, nor do we wish for them to die or for them to go and suffer through some sort of misery that sometimes as a child or as a son and daughter, those are things that can pop into our head or that can come naturally to us out of the evil that lies within. This is something that shouldn't be within us as believers. It is something that shouldn't even cross into our mind as believers. And instead, we understand that our hope is with the Father, that he will do justice and that he will guide our parents to understanding in any type of situation that we can find ourselves as. So our honor, our understanding all comes from the Father. And we know that He is the one that is guiding both our parents and us as well. And this is an example where we can see the difference between the humanist ethics and the perfect justice of the Father, as well as the way He carries His laws and ordinances and the benefit that it brings into our lives. The next set of instructions, or more so the next set of instruction or ordinance that we see, is one that we find in verse 16, which is the laws of violence in terms of kidnapping and or selling a person. Now, kidnapping a person and selling or keeping them was also punishable with death back then, given that nobody is the owner of anyone else and therefore cannot withhold the liberty of another person. Our only owner is the Eternal, and if anyone breached that instruction, it was as if they were going against the Creator, trying to establish themselves above Him. Now, we must note here that this was if they took that person involuntarily, as in taking possession of them as an object without letting anybody else know, or without that person themselves going before them and trying to serve them. Now, this did not apply to those whom the Israelites would go and become the slaves of, since this was voluntarily done so by them, and the Eternal had placed instructions as well as to what the treatment they were to receive from the masters. Now, today we can see many kidnapping cases done around the world, be it the kidnappers taking children or adults, and primarily we see these cases with children. And in many of these cases where the kidnappers, we see that they are found, but we don't always see the penalty of death being established. Instead, due to the humanist etiquette and to the softness of the human heart, instead of establishing that death penalty, many of them are given a penalty or a punishment where they still have the opportunity to come out to liberty, free to even continue doing the same thing. And if this instruction given by the Eternal were to be instilled everywhere, then we would see the kidnapping cases diminish. We would see more parents with their children. We would see less children being abducted by these people, being sold out for money purposes, and then these children placed into these horrible environments where they have to do horrible things. We would see all of these cases diminish if we applied this law that the Eternal was establishing, or that He established within His people of Israel. And this will be a benefit for us, because it will also bring fear into those people, into understanding that if they try to kidnap someone, then the consequence of that they would suffer would be one of death. And here again, we see the difference between the Eternal's perfect justice and the humanist's softness, that they have to seek the benefit of themselves and what they feel and what they think is correct, contrary to what the Eternal establishes and what He knows and understands. And we know that as the Creator, he knows and He understands the evil that resides within a man's heart. So that's why we see Him establish these ordinances that have these punishable or that are punishable for death. These ordinances that demonstrate that really mankind, or the heart of a man who does these evil acts, does not change. It does not change, and if it does change, then that's good. But in most cases, it doesn't change, and they continue doing the same thing and doing these things to people when they shouldn't be doing them. The next set of laws that we will see are the laws if people quarrel, and these are from verses 18 to 19. The Eternal established that if people quarrel against one another, and one of them strikes the other with their fist, or if they get to the point where they use a rock or a stone or any object that they have there in hand, then the one who received the hit did not die but laid in bed, then we see that after his recovery, he was able to stand up and walk without help. Then the one who struck him had to give and pay for the loss of the time that the other one spent in recovery, and they must also help them until they are thoroughly healed. But on the contrary, we will also understand and see that if that wasn't the case, and if they died, then they still received that punishment of death. In verses 20 to 21, we see that laws that have to deal with of an owner or master who hurts his servants. Now, if the servant died after being struck by their owner, then the owner had to be punished for the action. But if the servant did not die and he got up within 1 or 2 days and they were in recovery, then he would not be punished, and the servant's family would not be able to go against the owner since the servant is their property, meaning that they were working for the master. Continuing, the next set of laws that we see here, or the ordinance that we see here next, has to do with a pregnant woman who was harmed during a quarrel. And this is from verses 22 to 25. If men are fighting and the pregnant woman comes to be harmed, and the text doesn't really specify the reason as to why she would be harmed, if no harm follows, then the one who hit her would be fined, meaning that they'd have to give a payment of restitution for the harmed place into the pregnant woman, and the amount would be in accordance to what the husband demands of him, and he must pay what the judges determine. On the other hand, if harm does come along, maybe she loses her baby, or she is not able to get pregnant later on, and she is not able to give birth anymore, then the penalty would be life for life. Now, within this portion, and as well within the following verses, from verses all the way to verse 27, we see these examples where the famous phrase appears, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And this is something that we can probably hear oftentimes outside in the world when somebody does something wrong to us, or when we do something wrong to somebody else, then we hear this phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, meaning that just as you did to me, I'm going to do to you. So this is what the understanding that has been given behind this phrase. And in most cases, we see that it has taken into a connotation of vengeance. Now, these examples that the Eternal gave, or this instruction that the Eternal gave, the principle behind them is that if we cause a damage, then we must make up for the damage caused. That is the principle that the Eternal was trying to teach through here. And we don't fully understand this until we read the instruction or the meaning or teaching that Yeshua gave, that we can find in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 42. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evildoer, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him also the other. And the one wanting to sue you and take your shirt, let him also have your coat. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Yeshua teaches us the principle behind this commandment given by the Eternal. And although in the time it was given, it may have seemed far more severe, its application that we see, what the Eternal was trying to teach was the restitution amongst the Israelites, so there wouldn't be problems or conflicts between them. And Yeshua fully explains this instruction of the Eternal, but he also says that we not only have to restitute the damage done to our neighbor, not only do we have to pay back what we damage, or not only do we have to expect that as well from our neighbors, but we must also do it with excellence. We must do it with perfection, going above and beyond by giving more than what was damaged. It doesn't mean for us to literally allow ourselves to be punched twice, nor does it mean that we must also punch twice if somebody punches us. It doesn't mean that we have to only give, or that we have to allow ourselves to be mistreated all the time. No, on the contrary, we understand that if we see damage done, or if we do damage to somebody's property or to a person in general, both physically and mentally, then we must restitute. And this is the main principle that we see that Yeshua is teaching us within these verses, within this instruction. And this is what we see the Eternal teaching us as well. It means that whatever we damage, or any damage that is done to us, that we must do everything with excellence. Give back what was damaged, and even more still. And the last couple of verses that we're going to see here in chapter 21 deal with an aggression by an animal. Now, these are the last ordinances that the Eternal establishes. And these continue, or are more examples of the law of restitution. But in this case, it has to do with the harm that was done by an animal, and specifically talking about an ox. In verses 28 to 32, the Eternal establishes different ordinances based on any harm that is done by an ox. In verse 28, it says, if the ox gores a man or a woman so that they die, then the ox had to be stoned and its meat would be eaten. Yet the owner would not be at fault. Now, this first case can be deemed as something that occurs by the will of the Father as well. It was the first time that an ox gores a person, so we can infer that the Eternal used that ox to bring justice over a person. Previously, we saw the Eternal sometimes uses people or objects to do justice. And here we can see the same with an animal being used by the Eternal for his purposes. In verse 29, on the other hand, if the ox was already known to be goring in the past and a warning had already been given to its owner so they could put it away, lock it up or something, yet it was not kept pent up and they killed a person, then the ox would be stoned and its owner would also be put to death due to negligence and indifference, as he knew that his ox was dangerous and was therefore supposed to pent his ox. In verse 30, the owner, we see that is still given the opportunity to pay for the redemption of his life, but only if a ransom is placed over him and he is able to pay. If he was not able to pay and if there was no ransom placed over him, then the consequence was death. In verse 31, if the ox gored a son or a daughter, then the same rule or ordinance would be applied to both the ox and the owner. Whereas in verse 32, it says that if the ox gores a male or female servant, then the owner was to pay 30 shekels of silver to their master, and the ox was to be stoned. If an ox was already known to gore, then the reason behind them being put to death was so that they would not commit the same harm again. Today, if we look at the humanist ethic, then we will see that many people would probably defend this ox, stating that death would not be the solution to the harm the ox has done, since it is a poor, defenseless animal, and it is the people who are at fault for not training them, for not being worried around them. And maybe we don't see the situation applied to an ox, but we can see the situation applied to a dog. In many cases that we can hear in the news or our neighbors and stuff, we can hear cases where dogs hurt and abuse other adults and children as well, where because they are wild dogs that haven't been tamed fully, we see them do damage to other people. And in many of these cases, we see these humanist ethics play, and we see how many people defend the dog, saying that it's not the dog's fault, that the dog shouldn't be killed and the dog is being done, or that is injustice towards the dog, and the dog should be instead allowed to have its freedom and to be trained properly if possible. So this is what we see many humanist ethics or many people that follow with these humanist ethics. This is what we see them protect and defend. Yet, if we understand this fully, and if we look at this and we see how the Eternal is applying it within the scriptures, then we understand that these animals have animal instincts. They don't think about what is right or wrong, nor do they take pity on the life of a human. Maybe they can be trained to understand what they shouldn't do and what they should do, but they don't have the full understanding, and they don't know how to distinguish these sort of situations in the same way that a human does. Now, coming back to the ox, which is what we see here, if they're known to gore, then the best thing to do, as we see in the text, was to stone them so that other lives would not be placed in danger, so that other lives could be spared. And the death of the owner served as an example to other owners to also be wary of their ox, to make sure they are taking the proper precaution if they don't want to experience the same punishment. And in verses 33 to 36, we finally see the restitution that had to be done if an owner is at fault for the death of the neighbor's ox. If an owner uncovers a pit or digs one, and the owner's ox or the neighbor's ox falls into their pit, then he has to pay compensation. And he was to give money to the owner, and the dead animal would stay as theirs, since he was at fault for its death and it is inside their pit. On the other hand, if one man's ox hurts and kills another ox, then here we see that the restitution or compensation is to sell a live ox and divide the price and the dead ox between them. Or if the ox was known to be violent, then the price, and here we see the retaliation law being applied, would be ox for an ox, meaning that the life of the ox, or the ox that was still alive, my apologies, was put to death. So this is what ox for an ox meant. In the end, all of these laws teach us principles of restitution, of paying for the damage that we have caused, not just by giving back what was killed, stolen, or broken, but by giving 2 times or even more of what was the cost of the original. So this is what we see the main principle teaching behind all of this. And in chapter 22, from verses 1 to 15, we continue seeing examples of the law of restitution and how it was applied in different cases. We see when a thief was caught breaking in, then he had to make a full restitution. If he had nothing, then he paid with his life. If the owner that caught him killed him on accident through an injury, then he would not be at fault. And this was specifically talking about nighttime or during the times where the thief cannot be seen. But if the sun had risen and the owner killed the thief, then the owner would be at blood guilt. So this is one of the examples that we see of the restitution. We also see that if a man damages their neighbor's property, be it by their animal that crosses over to their field and starts eating or damaging that property, or through a fire, then they had to make that restitution with the best of their own field and vineyard, or they had to make a full restitution of all that was lost through a fire. There were also the cases where a man needs their neighbor, where if a man needs their neighbor for safekeeping or to look after their goods, be it materials or animals, and if their neighbor loses any of them, or sells them, or the animals die or hurt or are taken without seeing, then the man entrusted must pay the restitution depending on the Eternal's judgment. And here we begin to see where the Eternal's judgment starts to play. And this gives us the understanding that for a human being, that their moral etiquette isn't always fully correct. We see that in this case, for example, if the neighbor had lost any of these, or if the neighbor had to play any part in the selling of any of this, or maybe they ate it, then they had probably that opportunity to lie to their neighbor and tell them that they don't know what happened to their property, that they're not fully sure of it. And this is where we see that the Eternal begins to have this is where we see that the Eternal takes part in this, where he applies judgment. Because maybe he can lie to his neighbor, maybe he can lie to everybody else that surrounds him, but nobody can lie to the Eternal, because the Eternal knows the truth. He knows what lies within the heart of every single person. And orally, many of these times, or many of these situations, especially talking in this case where we see the trust between 2 men, or the trust between 2 Israelites, we see that many of these times orally the trust can be actually broken without one or the other knowing. But the Eternal knows, and that's why we see him establish judgment, and not just allowing the judges to, or allowing the people involved, or the judges at that time that were appointed by him, to be the ones who gave that punishment. And we also see the last case, that if a man borrows something from the neighbor and it is harmed or dies in the absence of the owner, then he must make full restitution. But if the owner is present, then they are not required to pay restitution, since both were present and both are in a way at fault, and the one who rented the animal only had to pay the rental fee. So these are the examples that we see with the laws of restitution. We also learn here the importance of having integrity before the Father. Maybe we can fool our neighbors, maybe we can fool our family, but we can't fool the Father. And the Father understands, and he knows everything that lies within our hearts and with our mind. So as believers, we must understand that when we do something wrong, we have to own up to that, and we have to suffer the consequences and deal with the consequences in a responsible and mature way. And we shouldn't seek to lying or to any of those other resources that the world teaches, that the world with its etiquette can apply or can allow. This is something that doesn't reflect the perfect justice of the Eternal. And we know that our testimony must always reflect this justice that the Eternal establishes, that he wants to see within his people. In the end, all of these examples that we have seen in these 2 chapters teach us very important principles. And some of these principles can be even found to be applied within our society. yet they are not endorsed exactly as we see it in the scripture, but its fundamental principle can be found. The issue, though, is that because we live in a corrupt system, many of these rights or principles are abused of. They are not properly enforced by the law, or because many different humanist movements have risen, going against some of these, such as the death penalty for a criminal or the death penalty for an animal, then we see more and more injustice being done than justice. We see more and more these evil acts done be permitted by people. There are even cases now where youth begin to fantasize or romanticize criminals. There are cases where youth begin to believe in criminals, or we even see in movies nowadays as well. We see where criminals or people that are portrayed as the heroes but are killing other people are portrayed as someone to look up to, or as someone that maybe the youth can aspire to be. And many of this influence that has risen from these humanist etiquettes, from these ethics that are taught within our society, we see that all of these feed into that injustice that we find in the world. And many of that feeds into the reason as to why we see all of these criminals increase, or all of this criminal act increase. But in the end, we understand that this is something that we're going to see within this world, within a world that doesn't live under the Father's guidance and instructions. And we also understand that mankind will always seek to fulfill and apply what benefits them, what satisfies their needs, and what they think in their humane opinion is right. If the world followed and applied the Eternal's principle with fear, understanding and applying the Messiah's teachings as well, then we wouldn't see this injustice in the world, and evil would be eradicated so it wouldn't be allowed to multiply. And this is the difference that we see between a humanist ethic and a perfect justice. While one continues to allow evil to grow and even promotes it, the Eternal's perfect justice is a benefit for all of us as believers. Not just to live a good moral life, but to also know how to accept when we are at fault and what we must do to pay back. We have to be conscious that just because we are living now in the Father's favor, it doesn't mean that everyone will forgive us for any wrong done, be it big or small. We must restitute the damage or offense done to the Eternal or to our neighbor. And such is the case with Zacchaeus. And this is a final example that we're going to see of restitution. Being a chief tax collector and a rich person or a rich man, we understand that there was a possibility of him cheating the Israelites of their money. This was very, very common within tax collectors. And even though the Israelites saw him as a sinner and rejected him, once Zacchaeus saw Yeshua and believed in his teachings, then he understood that as a believer, he had the responsibility to restitute for what he had done, which is what we see him do. He does justice by giving half of his possessions to the poor, and he repaid 4 times as much any damage he had caused to the Israelites. And as a result, the Messiah said in Luke chapter 19, verse 9, "Today salvation has come to this home, because he also is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." All in all, if we have ever done any damage in the past, or if we do any damage in the future, be it of property or even emotionally towards our family or our neighbors, then we must follow the Eternal's ordinances in Yeshua's correct interpretation of the Torah, so we can live with integrity before the Father, doing what is correct before his eyes. And that way salvation can also come into our home. And thus we won't be influenced by the humanist ethics of this world. May the Eternal help and guide us in understanding and discernment so we can continue serving him in his perfect justice. And with this, we conclude the video. We thank you all for watching, and we hope that we can continue reflecting on these studies as well, growing spiritually in our faith and also in our service to the Father. And in the Father's will, we will see ourselves in the next video. And again, we remind that you can also give us a like if you enjoyed or if you learned from this video, and you can also leave any questions, comments, or any recommendation topics in the comment section down below. Thank you all very much for watching, and blessings and shalom.